Hold on tight, little ones.
You won't believe what happened in this remote cabin. A 72-year-old widow who took in 2 non-human children during a snowstorm and became family to a species the world doesn't even believe exists. This is the true story of Agnes Keene, who lived alone in a remote cabin in Quehanna, Pennsylvania. One freezing night in the early 90s, she rescued 2 small, fur-covered creatures crying in the snow. What she didn't expect was that they would return years later, just to say goodbye. Contrary to popular belief, not all Bigfoot are dangerous. Some are intelligent, gentle, and capable of deep gratitude. Agnes cared for them, and they watched over her. Based on her real diary entries, this story reveals how silent kindness forged an unbreakable bond between an old woman and beings from the forest. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this tale has been called E.T. in the Wilderness, and how a simple act of compassion can echo through generations, human or not. Agnes, who had lost her only son, found healing in the most unexpected way. Through 2 forest creatures who returned her warmth and even cleaned and folded the blanket that once belonged to her son. If you've ever believed in miracles, don't scroll. This story may prove that some spirits in the woods are still watching, quietly, from the trees. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your country, or even your hometown, in the comments. I'd love to greet you properly and see just how far this story has traveled. The sky had turned the color of old pewter, dull and heavy like it might sink right onto the treetops. Agnes Keene stood on the back steps of her cabin, fingers knotted around a strip of rope, staring up at the swirl of crows that spiraled over the Quehanna wild area like something was dying in the woods. The wind had picked up quick, tugging at her flannel collar, rattling the high branches until red maple leaves peeled free and danced like sparks from a dying fire. There was a sound in it too. Not howling, not yet, but something deeper, slower, like a cello being played too close to the chest. She didn't flinch. Agnes had lived through too many autumns alone to be spooked by wind. But she watched the tree line like it had eyes. She turned, joints stiff, and made her way toward the chicken coop. The hens were already clumped in the corner, uneasy. The barometer dropped like it always did before the first real storm, the kind that didn't ask permission. She checked the latches, then hauled the tarp up over the roof, weighting the edges with firewood until it held. The whole structure groaned when a stronger gust pushed through. Her breath misted, and she pressed one hand flat to the boards, whispering something soft beneath her breath. Not words, just presence. Then she shuffled back toward the woodpile. The chopped oak was stacked in triangles, same way she'd done every year since Harold passed. He always said triangles wouldn't fall when the snow came thick. She still believed him. Agnes leaned into the weight of a wide log, dragging it toward the door where she'd brace it against the outer shutters. The sky dimmed further, like the light itself was hurrying underground. She could feel it pressing against her ribs, the way some silences do before thunder. Inside, the cabin held the smell of old books and drying herbs. A kettle trembled gently on the iron stove, not yet whistling. She laid the last log beside the hearth and brushed the grit from her hands. Her eyes drifted to the corner shelf. A chipped enamel cup rested there, blue rim faded to white in places. She picked it up carefully, thumb brushing over a dent near the handle. He'd used it the morning before the mine collapsed, spoon tapping the side in rhythm while he told her he'd be late getting back. That sound had lived in her bones ever since. Beside the cup was a folded patchwork square, stitched from shirts she never could throw out. She reached for it, held it for a moment, then folded it again and slid it into the pocket of her wool coat. Agnes opened the stove and tossed in a wedge of hickory. Flames licked up slow, crackling like brittle leaves. Shadows climbed the wall in shapes that didn't match the room. She sat in her rocker for a spell, not rocking, just breathing with the stove, letting the warmth press into her knees. Outside, the wind had gone strange. Less a gust and more a rhythm. It rattled the chimes once, then stopped, then again. 3 even taps against the eaves, like someone testing a door they weren't sure they wanted to open. She stood, slowly, then reached for the lantern. The glass was clean, her habits never faltering. She lit it with a practiced hand and watched the flames settle. The room bloomed gold. With her coat buttoned and scarf knotted, she stepped out again, boots creaking on the frost-slick boards. The wind hit her different now, colder, carrying something low, barely there, but not wind. Not an animal cry either. It came from the direction of the ravine, past the wood line where the sugar maples bent like old men. She paused at the edge of her porch, lantern held out like a question. Down the path, where the brush thickened and the snow had started to cling in the dips between roots, she saw movement. Not a rustle, not a scurry. Something small, curled. She hesitated, then stepped off the path into the brush, boots crunching softly. The lantern swayed, throwing light in slow arcs, until it caught on 2 shapes wedged between a snapped birch limb and the earth where it dipped into a half-frozen pocket. Fur, dark and soaked. Not a fawn, not cubs. They weren't breathing right. Agnes crouched, knees stiff, fingers trembling but sure. The larger one twitched as the lantern drew close, its eyes opening wide, startled, but not wild. The look it gave her wasn't desperation. It was recognition. The smaller one lay limp in its lap, curled into the crook of an arm that looked too long for anything she'd ever known. The wind passed through again and the larger figure whimpered, low and soft, chest trembling with it. She didn't speak. She didn't run. She leaned forward, reaching with one hand, palm up like you might with a stray dog that hadn't bitten yet. The creature flinched but didn't strike. When her hand touched fur, it was coarse but warm. She slid her arms under the little one first, barely the size of a toddler, and lifted it slow, cradling it against her like she would have cradled her son if time had turned back. The larger one watched, unmoving, eyes wide with something that hovered between hope and fear. Agnes nodded once, not to them but to herself. She reached again, grunting softly as she lifted the second creature, staggering slightly under the weight. The wind surged again, and the trees groaned like old ships. She turned, lantern held high, and walked back toward the cabin, boots slipping twice but never falling. Inside, the fire gave off a sleepy crackle. She laid the smaller form down first, wrapping it gently in the patchwork square and tucking the edges like she used to when Harold came home with sore ribs. The larger one hesitated in the doorway, ducking its head, then stepped in with a kind of quiet reverence. She guided it to the hearth, where it sank down, legs folded, arms still clutching the other. Agnes added more wood to the fire, then crossed to the kettle. Steam rose. She found another enamel cup, poured the hot water, added a pinch of dried berries and a slice of old apple, then set it beside them. The larger one looked at the cup, then at her. Its hand moved, 4 fingers, no thumb, and slowly lifted the cup. It sniffed first, then drank, careful, the way someone does when they've watched another first. Agnes sat back in her rocker, coat still on, scarf loose now. The lantern flickered, shadows playing across the cabin walls in slow motion. She watched them. The way the larger one adjusted the blanket, the way it checked the breathing of the little one, the way its head bowed, not in exhaustion, but in some deeper kind of devotion. Outside, the storm hadn't yet broken, but the pressure had shifted. A pause before the fall. Agnes glanced once toward the window, then back to the two figures at her hearth. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say, but inside her chest something tightened. Not fear, not even wonder. It was something like grief loosening its grip, just for a moment. The kettle whistled, loud and sudden. The larger one flinched. Agnes rose, slow and steady, and tended to it, pouring the rest of the hot water into a cracked mug and setting it on the table. Behind her, the wind picked up again. 3 knocks against the eaves. She didn't move, only breathed, eyes closed. Let the knocks pass through her like a memory coming back home. And somewhere outside, behind the curtain of wind, the woods waited. Not silent, just listening. The snow had come hard in the night, wet and heavy, sticking to every branch like candle wax, bending them low until some cracked with soft pops just beyond the edge of the cabin light. Agnes Keene stood by the window before dawn, one hand braced on the sill, the other wrapped around her ribs. The wind hadn't let up. It thudded against the shutters in waves, made the walls groan like old bones in the cold. She could feel it through the floorboards, every gust, every creak. She turned from the window slowly, scarf still tight around her neck though the fire was glowing steady. The 2 creatures she'd brought in the night before were huddled close to the hearth. The patchwork square had slipped halfway off the smaller one, and the larger had curled itself around it like a comma, its long back rising and falling in a rhythm that didn't feel animal. Agnes moved without a word, her wool socks soft against the planks, and adjusted the blanket with the same touch she'd once used to check her son's fever. The kettle let out a short breath of steam. She crossed to the stove, stirred the fire once, then reached for the dented pot she'd used since the 70s. She filled it with well water, dropped in a square of dry bread, a sliver of lard, and a pinch of salt. The smell of damp wood clung to her hands. She set the pot on the burner, watched it begin to tremble, then turned to the cupboard for the tin of dry milk. She moved slow, not out of fear, just careful. She didn't know what they needed, but she knew what warmth was, and that seemed a good place to start. The larger one opened its eyes. No sudden movement, just that slow, cautious lift of the head, its dark eyes catching the glow of the fire. Agnes didn't speak. She poured the warmed milk into her enamel cup, then walked over and set it down a few feet from them. The creature didn't reach for it, not right away. It blinked once, then shifted slightly, one long arm reaching down to adjust the small one's position. The child, or whatever it was, let out a soft breath, a whimper that sounded like air pressed through a reed flute. The larger one turned its face to Agnes, not pleading, just watching. The cup sat between them, steam rising. After a moment, the larger creature reached, long fingers curling around the warm tin. It lifted it slow, sniffed it, then brought it to its lips. When it drank, it didn't slurp or tilt, just one slow sip, as if testing the temperature. Then another. Then, with a kind of gentle reverence, it placed the cup back down. Agnes watched the motion, then turned back to the stove. She said nothing, just stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, the soft gurgle of thickening milk filling the room. Outside, the wind slammed again. The whole cabin shook. Snow hit the side of the house in sheets, rattling the windows, whispering around the roof. Agnes moved to check the latch on the back door. It held. She pressed a palm to the seam, feeling for cold, then nodded to herself and returned to the hearth. The smaller one had opened its eyes now, big, wet, blinking slow, like it didn't quite trust what it was seeing. Agnes lowered herself to one knee, slow and stiff, and reached for the old wool blanket she kept on the rocker. She draped it gently over the pair. The larger one didn't move, but it made a sound, something low and deep, like a hum with breath behind it. Not a growl, not a warning, almost soothing. The smaller one let out a tiny answering whimper and curled tighter. The fire popped, Agnes added a log. She sat on the floor now, her back against the rocker, eyes on the flame. The kettle hissed quietly. Somewhere under the floor, the frozen earth groaned. It was a strange kind of peace. Not warm, not safe, but something had settled in that room. Not trust, not yet, but a kind of truce. She looked up at the mantel. Above it, framed in dust, was the photo of her boy, back when he still had that toothy grin and mud on his collar from playing too close to the creek. She didn't go a day without noticing that picture. Today, she didn't look away. Her hand moved up, fingers grazing the corner of the frame. She closed her eyes. Not long, just enough to breathe through the ache. Then she opened them again and reached for the cast-iron pan. She fried what little bacon she had left, then soaked a few slices of stale bread in the drippings. It wasn't much, but it filled the cabin with a scent that made it feel like morning. She tore the bread into small chunks, laid them in a bowl, and carried it back to the hearth. The larger one didn't react at first, but the smell reached them. Its nostrils flared once, then slowly, with great care, it reached for the bowl. The smaller one stirred again, tried to lift its head, failed. The larger one turned, cradled it, then offered a piece of soaked bread. The child sniffed, then took it. Not like an animal, not like a scavenger, but like a baby would, fingers clumsy but determined. Agnes watched, hands resting in her lap, heart caught between grief and awe. Outside, a branch snapped, loud, too close. Agnes stood quickly, lantern in hand. She stepped toward the front door, listened. Nothing but the storm. Still, she double-checked the latch, then peered through the crack in the shutters. Snow. Endless. Blowing sideways. No tracks. No figures. Just the endless white. She turned back and stopped. The larger one had moved. It now sat closer to the fire, its legs tucked under. The child nestled against its side. But it had done something odd. It had taken 3 short logs and placed them carefully in front of the hearth. In a triangle. Not random. Not clumsy. Purposeful. Agnes stared at it. Then at the creature's face. It wasn't looking at her. Just at the fire. But it knew she'd seen. She sat down again, slower this time, and drew the patchwork square closer. She checked its edges, then folded it tighter and laid it beside them. The creature reached for it, pulled it gently over the child again. Its fingers lingered on the stitching, tracing the lines like it understood something about thread and time. The wind cried again, high and sharp, and something hit the roof. Agnes winced, hand instinctively reaching for the stove poker. But nothing followed. The cabin held. She stood again, slower now, and checked the ceiling for leaks. The old nails groaned, but stayed. She took comfort in that, and in the fact that they, whatever they were, hadn't tried to leave. Night settled in early. The light turned purple behind the windows, then black. Agnes lit the oil lantern and set it by the hearth. She fed the stove again, then poured the last of the hot water into the tin cup and offered it without a word. The larger creature took it with a small nod, just a tilt of the head. Not a bow, not a mimic, something else, something that felt aware. She pulled a chair close and sat, knees aching. The wind battered the house again, and somewhere outside, a tree moaned under the weight of ice. Agnes closed her eyes, just for a second, then opened them again. She felt the weight of it then. The knowing that this wasn't just kindness, wasn't just shelter. She had crossed something, opened a door she hadn't known was there, and whatever came next, she would not pretend this hadn't mattered. She looked at the photo of her son one last time before the lantern burned low. Then, to the shapes beside the hearth. No longer strangers, not quite guests, just beings caught in the same storm. And somewhere deep in her chest, below the loneliness and the silence and the cold, Agnes whispered a promise. Not aloud, not in words, just the kind of vow that keeps itself alive in the bones of a woman too old to lie to herself anymore. She would keep them safe until the storm passed, no matter what they were, no matter what the world would think. She would not let them die under her roof. Not again. The world outside had gone white, not the gentle kind, not snow like postcards or Sunday hymns, but a heavy, silencing kind that piled up against the cabin like the mountain meant to swallow it whole. 3 straight days now, the sky hadn't lifted, and the light behind the windows was a cold blue, the kind that made skin look bruised and breath come shorter. Agnes Keene hadn't heard birds in 2 mornings. Just the stove crackling, her boots moving slow across wood, and sometimes, softest of all, the sound of something breathing beside her that did not belong to any name she'd ever grown up knowing. She'd cleared a path from the hearth to the water pail by the door, then to the stove and back again. Everything else had disappeared under cold. The windows wore a thick glaze of ice, curling at the corners like salt rings in a skillet. She didn't bother trying to scrape them anymore. Whatever world sat on the other side didn't need watching. Not now. Not while they were still inside. The 2 creatures hadn't spoken, if that's even what it was. The older one had made a sound once or twice, that same hum she'd heard the first night, but it wasn't noise like people made. It was more like breath wrapped in memory. The little one hadn't left the hearth. It shivered some in its sleep. Agnes had tried her best, kept the fire going, mashed up bits of potato and stale bread softened with warm milk, left out the cored apples from her cold cellar. They ate when they wanted. No rhythm she could track, but they never wasted. Not once. On the 2nd day, just as she was wiping her hands dry, she turned and saw the larger one kneeling by the stove. It wasn't reaching for food. It was watching her. Not staring, watching. It mimicked the way she stirred the fire, fingers miming the motion a few inches from the iron. Then it looked at the logs beside the hearth. With slow, careful movements, it took 3 slender pieces of wood and arranged them, flat, then cross, then angled again, until they made a perfect triangle. Not sloppy, not childlike, measured, as if it had seen it done and wanted to remember how it felt in the hands. Agnes didn't say a word. She just folded the dish rag and walked back to the table. But she saw, and she knew it saw her seeing. Later that afternoon, the cabin filled with the smell of boiling cabbage and bacon grease. She'd portioned it out small, careful not to waste. The storm didn't look like it had quit soon, and she had only what she'd canned, plus the root cellar and the bag of dried oats she'd set aside for deep winter. She divided the food 3 ways, placed each bowl with quiet hands. The larger creature took its share only after she sat down again. The little one whimpered and tucked its face against the blanket. That night, long after the fire dimmed to orange coals, Agnes woke to the sound of a chair moving. Just one creak, then stillness. She sat up slow, bones aching, blanket still pulled to her chin. In the half-dark, lit only by dying firelight, she saw it. The creature had moved the small wooden stool, the one Harold had made when their boy was just 3 years old, and set it by the door. It sat there, silent, unmoving, back straight, watching the room, watching the night. She lay back down, heart slow but not afraid. And for some reason, in that moment, she didn't feel like the one keeping them safe. The 3rd morning came colder. Ice had claimed the porch steps. She cracked the door open to shake out her mop and nearly slipped. The wind bit through the gap like teeth, but on the railing outside, tucked against the snow-drifted wood, was a basket, small, woven tight. Inside, 3 eggs, speckled, warm to the touch like they hadn't sat there long. She blinked at it, looked out across the yard. No tracks. Just the impression of someone who knew how to move without leaving footprints, or someone who understood the wind well enough to erase them. Wren. It had to be. She took the basket in, shut the door behind her, locked it. Not fear, just habit. Wren Mallory had always been a quiet one, 16, maybe 17 now. Grew up just past the bend on Old Whitaker Road. Used to leave little bundles of lavender and mint on her porch rail back in July. Never knocked, just offerings. Like she knew something was needed but didn't want to ask. Agnes fried one of the eggs and mashed the rest into a soft mix for the little one, who hadn't stood up in 2 days. When she brought the food near, the larger one didn't move at first. Then, slow and silent, it reached out, not for the bowl, but for her wrist. Just for a moment. The touch was light, careful, not to stop her, just to feel. Then it let go. Later, by the fire, she took out her old knitting box. Not to knit. Her hands were too stiff now, but to look. At the bottom, beneath the yarn and the rusted thimble, lay a pair of red wool gloves. Child-sized. She didn't remember packing them. Hadn't seen them in years. She unfolded them, still soft, still holding the smell of cedar. That night, as the wind howled and the walls flexed like ribs, she placed the gloves beside the fire, folded neat. Not pushed, not offered, just placed. She didn't expect anything. But the next morning, they were gone. In their place, a polished stone. Flat, smooth, warm like it had been held in a palm for a long time. She left it where it lay. By the 4th day, the storm began to ease. Not gone, but softer. The air lost its sharp edge. The wind became more whisper than shriek. The ice on the windows cracked in gentle veins, and a sliver of sunlight found its way across the floorboards, narrow and golden as a promise. Agnes stood at the window, hands on the sill again. She watched the tree line. The hush was new. A pause, a breath before the melt. She felt it before she knew it. They would go. Not that day, maybe, but soon. The way wild things know the second a storm is done pretending. Behind her, the fire popped once. She turned. The larger one stood, back, long and shadowed. Its shoulders hunched slightly beneath the wool blanket she'd given. It looked down at the little one, who had started to stir now, eyes blinking against the light. Then it looked to her, and she nodded. Not to say yes, not to give permission, just to say she understood. They never asked. But still, some things didn't need asking. She moved to the cabinet, opened it, and took down the jar of dried berries she'd saved since autumn. She poured them into a small cloth pouch and laid it near the door. Not as a gift, as rations, just in case. The larger one moved to sit again, this time beside her, not opposite, not across a line. The child leaned against its side and for the first time made a sound. A hum, deep and low, but bright at the edges. Agnes closed her eyes. Just for a second, and in that hum she could hear it. The sound of something remembering its way home. She didn't speak, just reached for the stone they'd left and held it flat in her palm. The warmth was still there, not from fire, but from touch. And somewhere in the stillness, in the corners of a room built for solitude, she felt a shift. Not in the storm, not in the creatures, but in herself. Something loosening, something letting go. Or maybe, just maybe, something returning. And the triangle of wood by the fire stayed unbroken, because some patterns once taught are never forgotten, even by hands not quite human. And even when they're gone, the shapes they leave behind know how to wait. The morning sky hung silver and still. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has wrung everything dry and left the world blinking, unsure if it survived. Agnes Keene opened the back door with both hands, fingers braced against the swollen wood, and stepped into the hush. Her boots sank into the wet snow, soft now from 3 days of melt and sun, and her breath came white and clean. The storm had passed, not just in the sky, in her body too. That weight behind her ribs, the fear that something wild and fragile might not make it, had lifted. She didn't say it aloud, just felt it, deep in her hands as she ran them down the railing, past the icicles that were no longer sharp. The world had shape again. The cabin stood firm. The trees had found their lines, but it was the footprints that stopped her. She hadn't seen them before. Not clearly. Maybe they'd been there all along, hidden under the thick snow. But now, plain as pressed clay, they circled the yard in a slow, deliberate arc. Each one nearly twice the size of her own boot, 5 toes, wide heel, spaced too far apart for any man. They didn't start from anywhere. They didn't lead away. Just circled, like something had been watching, waiting. Agnes didn't move at first, just followed the trail with her eyes, then with her body. Around the coop, past the woodpile, right to the porch steps. They stopped there. No sign of weight, no scuff on the boards. Just presence, then gone. She looked to the edge of the woods. Nothing stirred, but her heart picked up. Not fear, not yet, just knowing. She turned back inside, slower than usual, and shut the door behind her. The creatures were already near the window. The little one stood for the first time, legs wobbly, arm held tight to its companion. Their fur had dried fully now, brushed back in places like someone had been grooming them during the long nights. They pressed their faces to the frost-glazed glass, but they weren't looking out like children do. They weren't curious. They were listening. The larger one pressed a hand flat to the window pane. A sound came from its chest. Not a hum, not a word, but a breath drawn slow through old lungs and released like a signal. The little one answered it, not with a sound, but by shifting its weight. Eyes fixed on the woods. Agnes stood behind them. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. A few minutes passed before she saw it. A shadow at the far tree line. Tall, still, not hunched like a man, not slouched like a bear, upright, solid. Then another, then 2 more. They didn't walk forward. They emerged, like they'd always been there, only now deciding to let themselves be seen. They stood in a formation, spaced wide, arms at sides, faces unreadable at this distance. The larger creature beside her made that breath sound again. This time, softer. More like a rhythm than a call. The little one pressed close to it. Their bodies seemed to understand. Agnes stepped back. She moved to the corner near the stove, fingers tight around the edge of the table, her chest pulling in shallow and slow. Then the 2 stepped away from the window. No panic, no glances back. The larger one walked first, slow and steady, and opened the door without touching the handle, just pressing gently with its shoulder. The little one followed, smaller steps, breath misting fast from its nose. They moved across the porch, down the steps, and into the yard without a sound. The others didn't move. Agnes stood at the door now, lantern in one hand, eyes not blinking. The morning light washed everything in cold gold. Shadows long and deliberate, the kind that hides nothing. She watched them cross the clearing, watched as the 2 she'd fed and kept warm for 4 days, stepped out into the open and paused. Not halfway, not in the middle, just enough. Then the largest of the figures stepped forward. It was female. That much was clear now. Not from softness, but from the way the others shifted their stance, ever so slightly, in response to her movement. Her body was wide in the shoulders, long in the limbs, and her fur was thick and dark, streaked with what looked like ash or maybe snowmelt. She stopped a few paces from the 2 young ones. They didn't run to her. They waited. Then, in one motion, the matriarch reached her arms forward. Not out, not open, but up and then down, like draping something invisible across their shoulders. The larger child stepped in first, then the smaller. Their foreheads touched her chest briefly, one at a time. It wasn't an embrace. It was something older. Agnes didn't realize she was holding her breath until it shuddered loose. Then the matriarch turned, not toward the woods, toward her. Agnes froze. The figure held her gaze. From across the yard, from the place where wilderness meets memory. She didn't look curious, or cautious, or angry. She looked knowing. Then she did something Agnes had not expected. She bowed her head, not deeply. Just enough that the motion broke the line of her shoulders. A gesture with weight, with shape, like saying I saw. Agnes's mouth opened a little, but no sound came. She felt her hand lower the lantern without thinking. Her body stilled. Her eyes burned. Behind the matriarch, the others stood motionless. Then, in turn, each of them pressed a hand to their chest and opened it outward. Flat palm. Not a wave, not a farewell. An offering. They didn't come closer. They didn't speak. They turned in silence and disappeared back into the woods, not scattering, not vanishing, just receding like tidewater. Agnes stepped onto the porch, knees unsteady. The morning had gone still again, the prints in the yard already softening. She stood there until the cold worked through her coat, until the last of the shadows had folded back into the forest. Then she turned and saw it. At the edge of her fence, hung gently on the old wire post, was a braid of dried grass, twisted tight, hung with care. Not a threat, not a warning, a mark. She walked to it, reached out, touched it with one finger. The strands held firm. There was no note, no token, just the wind, brushing through the trees again, and the faint warmth still clinging to the porch where they had stood. Agnes closed her eyes, let the air move over her. Not alone, not anymore. And behind her, in the silence of the house, the triangle of firewood still stood untouched. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't even goodbye. It was a beginning written in footprints, breath, and silence, left only for those who knew where to look. The last of the snow had vanished into the black soil. Spring in Quehanna didn't announce itself with blossoms or bluebirds, but with the slow drip of thawed water from the eaves, the soft collapse of ice underfoot, and the way the forest began to breathe again. Agnes Keene moved slower these days, not from age, though age had surely settled in, but from the memory of silence, the kind of silence that had sat beside her fire, that had once tucked itself under her patched blanket, that had left behind not absence, but presence, like the echo of a bell long since rung. That morning the porch was damp. Her boots sank a little when she stepped outside, the boards darkened by melt. She'd come to check the coop, though the hens were clucking steady again and the fox hadn't shown since last winter. It was just habit. But she stopped short. There, right against the side rail where the snow used to bank up high, hung a braid of grass. Still fresh, still green, twisted with something red. A cluster of berries, dried now but unmistakably placed. Below it, the woodpile had been redone, stacked in 3 symmetrical peaks, triangular and precise. The shape brought heat to her chest. She didn't smile. Not really, but something in her face softened. Her hand reached out, not to touch, just to hover beside the braid. A gesture in kind. She turned slowly and looked out past the chicken wire, across the thinning woods. Nothing stirred. But the gift had been placed, which meant someone had come, and more than that, they had returned. She left her offering after breakfast. Not on the rail, not anymore. That felt too exposed now, too obvious. The line between safety and danger had grown thin since the melt. She placed the corn cakes, dried apples, and a handful of pecans in a woven basket, the old kind she used for foraging mushrooms. Then she walked down the back slope, where the path bent near the split cedar and ducked beneath the footbridge at the creek. There, in the space just wide enough for shadow to settle, she left the basket nestled among the moss and wet stone. She brushed the earth around it with a bundled switch of laurel to erase the prints. By the time she returned up the slope, her knees ached, but her chest felt lighter. Not joy, not relief. Something steadier, like faith but quieter. Late that afternoon, Wren Mallory came by. She didn't knock, just stood out by the fence like she always did. holding a jar of honey in one hand and a bundle of sweet potatoes in the other. Her coat was too thin. Agnes waved her in with a tilt of her head. They sat on the porch steps, like neighbors too used to the cold to be bothered by it. "I brought the last jar," Wren said, tapping the honey. "Dad's bees didn't overwinter too well." Agnes took it gently, nodding once. "You getting eggs again?" "Yeah, yours are always cleaner." They fell into silence, the kind that had more weight than chatter. After a minute, Wren shifted. "I saw something out by the back bend." Her voice dropped just enough. "Tall, real tall. Thought it was a tree, but it moved." Agnes didn't look up. She just tied the twine back around the jar. "I left carrots in the snowbank 2 nights ago," Wren added. "Gone by morning, clean, not dug, just gone." Agnes still didn't speak. Wren hesitated. "You ever seen—" She caught herself. "You ever heard anything strange? Like knocking?" Agnes turned then. Met the girl's eyes. Her own steady, but not cold, not guarded. "You know what I think?" she said softly. Wren nodded. "I think some things don't want to be known," Agnes said. "But they notice who's worth knowing." Wren looked out toward the woods. "Is that safe?" "No," Agnes shook her head. "Not always." They sat a while longer. Wren didn't press. She never did. That night, as the air turned damp and the frogs returned to their hollers in the lowland, Agnes went back to the porch. She didn't expect anything, but on the bottom step, right where the wood met the earth, lay a single black feather, long, curved, clean. And beside it, a string of 3 cracked hickory nuts, bound together with a twist of grass. No sound came from the trees, but she felt them there, watching maybe, or waiting. A day later, Hank Delmore stopped by on patrol. He didn't get off his 4-wheeler, just slowed near the fence and tipped his hat. "Gotta tell folks to be careful," he called out. "Somebody's been setting traps down by the lower trail. Real nasty snares." Agnes stepped out with her coat still half-buttoned. "Animals caught?" "Not yet, but I found fresh blood on the branch line. Not deer, smaller, might be coyote, might not." He frowned. "Whoever it is, they ain't local. No one around here uses metal wire like that. Too clean." Agnes crossed her arms. "You gonna tell folks?" Hank looked up at the ridge, then back to her. "Think I'll start pulling the ones I find, quietly." She nodded once. He left the way he came, tires kicking up soft mud. That evening she changed her pattern. She didn't leave the basket under the bridge. Too close. Too obvious. Instead, she hiked farther up the back ridge to where an old logging road split in 2. She placed the corn cakes and squash under a collapsed stump, covered it with fern, then used pine needles to brush away her tracks. She didn't go straight home. She looped wide, checked for movement, and just before reaching the slope behind her property, she saw it, far off, near the clearing where the birch trees leaned too close together. A figure, not tall like before, but broad, still. It didn't move toward her, didn't run, just raised one arm slow, pressed it to its chest, then opened its hand to the sky. Then it was gone. That night she found the basket returned. Empty. But inside it, tucked where the corn cake had been, was her own scarf, the one she'd left on the porch rail back in January. She hadn't remembered losing it, but it was clean. Smelled faintly of moss and wood smoke. She brought it inside, folded it, placed it beside the patchwork blanket, and for the first time in weeks, she locked the door, not out of fear, out of respect, because now she knew they trusted her to keep quiet, and she would. Not because she had to, but because it was hers now too. The silence between the forest and the fence. The covenant that held no words but moved like breath through the trees when no one was watching. And somewhere out there, past the slope, past the traps, past the noise of men who hunted what they didn't understand, a circle was forming, not of danger, of warning, of trust earned the long way round. And that night, when the wind shifted and the stars blinked through the branches, She heard a single note. Not a whistle, not a call. Just a low humming tone that curled around her window frame and faded. And Agnes, lying there in the dark, opened her eyes and listened. Because sometimes, when you've held a secret long enough, the secret begins to sing back. Under the weight of early summer, the woods had thickened into something restless. The kind of thick where even the light moved slow. Cicadas screamed in waves and the air smelled sharp, like wet bark and iron. Agnes Keene moved down the trail with a rhythm she hadn't used since her knees were young. Each step deliberate, every pause stitched with listening. She had the basket tucked beneath her shawl, same as always. Corn cakes wrapped in burlap, dried berries folded inside a handkerchief. But today, the usual route didn't feel safe. Not after what Hank said. Not after the note he didn't leave. But she could feel in his voice. It wasn't the forest that had changed. It was the people. Somebody was out here who didn't belong. She took the long way, cutting between switchbacks, beneath low dogwood boughs, and through pockets where the moss grew thickest. She didn't hum like she used to. Didn't talk to herself. The birds weren't chirping much either. They knew when the ground had gone wrong. By the time she reached the bridge, sweat clung behind her ears, and her breath had turned short. She didn't set the basket beneath it. Not this time. She crouched beside the water's edge, reached into the mud, and lifted a fallen stone, underneath, a hollow, black and dry. She pushed the basket into it and covered the mouth with laurel. When she stood, her spine cracked loud enough to make her wince. She adjusted her scarf and turned back uphill, staying off the usual track. Halfway home, she caught it. A smell. Sour metal and old rust. And voices. Not birds, not wind. Men. She dropped behind a downed pine, one hand tight around a sapling root. Two of them came through the clearing not 20 feet away. One older, square jaw, thick jacket with the cuffs cut off. The other younger, wiry, carrying a coil of steel cable over his shoulder. Neither looked like hikers. The older one carried a crossbow. Agnes felt the heat drain from her face. They didn't speak much. The younger one pointed to the bend in the trees. The older nodded. Then they vanished behind the ferns. But their scent stayed. She waited, counted a full 100 heartbeats. Then she slipped downhill, boots quiet in the wet loam, breath shallow. She didn't stop until the edge of her clearing came into view. The cabin crouched in the golden heat like it had been holding its breath too. But before she reached the steps, she froze. Wren was there, half kneeling behind the rain barrel, her braid damp with sweat, a jar of honey in her hands. She looked up and saw Agnes, her eyes wide, her voice just a whisper. "There's men in the woods." "I know," Agnes said. Her own voice was flatter than she meant. "Come inside." They shut the door slow, bolted it, then closed the inner shutters. Agnes lit the oil lamp low. Wren wiped her palms on her jeans. "They had traps," she said. "Wire ones. I saw one hung from a pine, real high." Agnes nodded. "They're hunting something, not deer." Wren looked at her, waiting for her to say it. But Agnes didn't. She opened the stove and fed the coals. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge. The frogs stopped singing. The woods exhaled. Wren stayed for supper. They didn't speak much. She picked at her food, eyes darting to the windows. After dark, Agnes walked her to the back door. "You take the creek trail. Stay in the low brush. Don't light nothing. Don't run. And don't speak if you hear anything that speaks first." Wren swallowed, then nodded once. Before she left, she placed the jar of honey on the steps. It was midnight when the smell returned. Agnes had dozed off in her chair, shawl wrapped around her legs, the lantern still flickering low. But the sharp tang of sweat and grease pulled her awake like a slap. She sat up straight, her fingers curling around the poker by the hearth. Through the window, nothing moved, but the night had gone dead still. Too still. Then metal, a soft clink, maybe 20 yards off. Agnes stood, moved to the door without turning the light up. Her feet made no sound on the floor. Another sound now, thicker, a splash. The creek. She stepped out, slow and careful. Just past the porch, she stopped. Smoke, not from her chimney. Behind the second ridge, faint and curling. She didn't think. She moved. She carried the lamp but kept the flame down low, her other hand wrapped in the old wool scarf she now tied around her palm like a grip. She didn't take the path. She moved through brush, through muck, ducking low when the wind shifted. Then she saw it. A trap. New. Wire strung between two birches. But the bait wasn't meat. It was blood. A smear of something fresh on a rag tied to the line. Beneath it, the grass was pressed flat. She heard a cough. Not human. A sound like pain thick in the throat. She moved faster. Down the incline, over the wet roots, toward the smoke. And there, at the creek edge, was the fire. Not large, just a burn pile, but enough to make shadows dance on the trunk of a tree. And at the base of it, a shape. Massive. Collapsed. Breathing shallow. One arm tucked under, the other twisted back. Mud caked into the fur. A line of red ran across the flank. Fresh. And standing over it. Nothing. No men. No movement. Agnes dropped to her knees beside it. The eye opened. Not all the way, but enough. She didn't speak. She took the scarf from her wrist and pressed it to the wound. Not hard, just enough to show something had arrived. The creature didn't flinch. Then, somewhere in the trees, a cry. Human. Two voices, running. Agnes stood. She grabbed a branch from the burn pile and kicked it into the wet moss, sending smoke in every direction. Then she grabbed another, threw it downhill. From behind the next hill, two flashlights cut through the dark. She didn't run. She stepped backward, then tossed her lantern hard down the slope. The light shattered. The men shouted. Then the rain came, fast, sudden, a wall of water that hissed across the canopy. And through it, a shadow stood. Not her. Not them. Another. Larger. The sound of boots slipping. A scream. And then, silence. Agnes stayed still. She waited until the rain passed, until the smoke blew clear. When she returned to the creek, the injured creature was gone. The fire was gone, only mud. And one print, deep and clear, where a knee had pressed into earth. She made her way home soaked and shaking. The next morning on her porch rail lay her scarf, clean, folded, and beside it, one strip of laurel, tied in a knot, and 3 small triangles of firewood, balanced with care, not just thanks. A message, we see, we know, and now, we protect too. Not long after sunrise, the wind turned gold. It moved low through the field grass behind Agnes's cabin, pushing it in long waves like someone smoothing a blanket. The sky was high and bare, no clouds to hold it down, and the morning light slanted through the trees with that sharp, dry edge that only late autumn knows. When the earth has stopped blooming but hasn't yet gone to sleep. It was the kind of morning that made everything visible, the kind that didn't keep secrets. Agnes Keene stood at the threshold in her old barn coat, mug in hand, staring out at the frost-tipped yard. She'd slept poorly. Dreams of snapping branches and stone-cold silence had pulled her from sleep before the first bird song. Now, steam rose from her cup in slow ribbons as her eyes fixed on the fence. It was there again. Something hung on the rail post beside the gate. She didn't have to get close to know it hadn't been there yesterday. The shape was too careful, too specific. She walked toward it, boot soles brushing against fallen corn husks. A ring of braided corn husks, dried, twisted, knotted with a thin cord of bark. At the base of the post sat a single, long black hair, too coarse for a horse, too straight for a bear. She bent down, picked it up, turned it in the light. A gift, or a sign. She didn't know which anymore. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. "Morning, Agnes." She straightened slowly. Hank Delmore stood on the porch, holding his hat in both hands like he was waiting to be judged. His ranger coat hung open, a dusting of pine needles clinging to the shoulders. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "You didn't." Her voice was low, same as always. "Coffee's hot." He nodded, stepped inside, and she followed. In the kitchen, the light pooled warm across the countertop. Agnes poured 2 cups, set them down without a word. They sat at the small table beneath the window, the one that looked out over the ridge. Hank took a slow sip, eyes on the steam. "I came to ask something," he said after a while, "but I don't want you to answer unless you mean it." Agnes didn't nod, didn't blink. "You've been here a long time," he continued. "Longer than me, longer than most, and I know what folks say about this stretch of woods. Always have. Shadows, voices, sounds that don't belong." She watched him closely. "I've been finding snares again," he said. "Deeper in, closer to the gully trail, but someone's been beating me to them. They're tripped, disabled, buried." He looked at her now. Really looked. "Someone's cleaning up," he said. "Quiet, smart, not just animals." Agnes sat still. "Is there something I should know?" he asked. "Something you haven't told me?" The silence between them filled the room. The clock ticked on the far wall. Outside, a squirrel chittered and fled up the trunk of the oak. Agnes set down her mug. "It's not something that wants to hurt us," she said. Hank didn't flinch, but his throat moved when he swallowed. "You've seen it?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Agnes's gaze didn't move from his. "You felt it," she said. "That's why you came." He didn't argue. Instead, he turned his mug in slow circles on the wood grain. "I heard something last night," he said. "Near the creek bed. Heavy steps. No lights. Just breath in the dark." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't follow," he added. "Didn't even raise my light." Agnes stood, crossed the room. She reached into the drawer beneath the stove and pulled out a folded wool blanket. Tucked inside was a length of thick rope, frayed at one end, knotted at the other. She set it gently on the table in front of him. "You know what this is?" Hank nodded. "From the lookout traps. We used that kind of rope back in '82. Found it on my porch 2 weeks ago," she said. "Wasn't mine, wasn't touched." He ran his thumb along the knot, then looked at her. "They left it for you?" Agnes didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, a gust of wind kicked dry leaves across the porch, and the screen door tapped gently in its frame. They sat a little longer, neither one drinking. Then Hank stood. "I won't tell anyone," he said. "I know." He hesitated at the door, then said, "I'll pull the rest of the snares, and I won't leave prints." Agnes nodded once. By the time he drove off, the morning had warmed into stillness. The sky a clean blue. The only sound, the soft rustle of corn stalks drying on their frames. She went back inside, gathered the last of the harvested kernels, measured out what she'd need, then took a sliver of the husk wreath and wrapped it around the bundle like ribbon. She walked the slope behind the barn, down to where the roots curled up around the creek bed, and left it beneath the old iron pipe where the moss ran thickest. She didn't say goodbye. Later, just before dusk, she stepped out to bring in the porch basket, and stopped. Out past the chicken wire, just beyond the dying brambles, 2 figures stood, tall, still, not hiding. They didn't move forward, didn't gesture. They just stood. And though the light was thin and the angle long, she knew them. Taller now, broader, but familiar. The 2 young ones, the ones who'd once slept by her fire. She didn't wave. She didn't dare. She just stepped out past the threshold, let the wind catch her hair. Hank had long since gone home. He would not see what she saw. But the woods did, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not memory, not mourning, just recognition. After a long beat, the figure stepped back, melted into the trees. She turned to go back inside, but something caught her eye. At the gate, resting beside the latch, lay a bundle of twisted grass and husk, and within it, a single strand of dark fur, longer than her hand. She picked it up, felt the weight of it. Not just a gift, a thread, tied back to a promise that hadn't been spoken, and wouldn't need to be. Because some family doesn't ask to be known, they just return. The fog had settled before dawn, thick and low, folding the ridge like a wool blanket too heavy to lift. The boards of the porch were slick under Agnes Keene's boots, and the cold in the air wasn't the kind that bit. It crept, seeped in gentle, steady, patient, as if it had always been there, a quiet that didn't want to be broken. She stood at the top step, her wool coat pulled close, hands in the pockets where the seams had gone thin, and stared out at the yard. The grass was slick with dew, the wooden rails beaded with mist. The trees kept their distance, outlines soft like old memories. And out beyond the field, where the woods began to lean in on themselves, the light was starting to shift. She'd known this day would come. The ache behind her ribs had started 3 weeks back, not sharp, but deep, like something forgotten was making itself known again. The doctor in town had said the quiet things, the soft things, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough to mean she couldn't wait out the winter in that cabin. Not this year, not alone. A wagon would come for her. The Thompsons from town had offered. Said they'd take her down into Clearfield, where the clinic had warm beds and someone to bring her tea, where the nurses had names she didn't know. She'd promised she'd go. Just for a spell, she told them. Just long enough to figure things out. But she knew. So did they. Now the morning had come, and the slope down to the creek was too slick for her knees. Her breath fogged the air in steady bursts, each one slower than the last. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at the step where she'd always left the basket. Instead, she placed the notebook, the one with the soft cover, the pages full of seed schedules and crop yields, frost dates and bloom patterns. Nothing about them, nothing written, but she knew they'd understand. The notebook was her way of saying, I was here. I tended this. I kept the gate closed when the storms came, and I didn't forget. She laid it gently on the wood and stepped back. The air was still. No birds, no wind. Only the sound of her own breath, and somewhere behind it, something lower, deeper. It began as a vibration, in the soles of her boots, in the wood beneath her. Then it grew. Not a roar, not thunder, just a tone, smooth, steady, as if the earth itself had drawn a bow across a string buried miles beneath the soil. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She looked up toward the ridge, and there, just visible where the fog began to thin, stood a figure, massive, still. It didn't wave, didn't speak. It lifted a hand to its chest, pressed palm to fur, held it, then opened the hand, slowly, toward her. A gesture she'd seen before. She bowed her head once, not deeply, just enough, then turned back to the door, hands trembling as she reached for the handle. Behind her, the wagon wheels clattered on the gravel drive. She heard the voice of the driver call her name, kind, familiar, but distant. She didn't answer. She took one last look inside the cabin. The stove cold. The chair by the fire still tucked in, the blanket folded over the back rail. Nothing left out of place. Nothing forgotten. She stepped down carefully, gripping the railing, knees aching with each move. The wind had shifted slightly, enough to push the fog sideways like a curtain parting slow. The wagon sat quiet at the edge of the road, the mule's breath rising like smoke. She climbed up with the help of a hand she didn't know and settled into the bench seat. The driver tipped his hat. Clearfield's about an hour out, he said. We'll take it slow. She didn't reply, just nodded once. The wheels turned, the earth gave way beneath them. The cabin faded behind the mist. But when the wagon cleared the bend, when the trees swallowed the house whole again, the porch was not empty. Under the steps, half tucked into the mud where her boots used to rest, sat the enamel cup. It hadn't been there when she left. Now it sat cradled in the earth, its rim clean, its side dented exactly as before. And around it, arranged with care, 3 small stacks of firewood, each shaped in perfect triangles, each leaning just enough to show they had been placed, not dropped. There was no sound, but the wind moved under the eaves again, not sharp, not shrill, just low. A murmur, a breath through old timber, and on the porch, where her feet had once stood, the fog held its shape a little longer before disappearing into the morning. Agnes did not turn around, but something inside her had already answered. Because some goodbyes don't get spoken, they get carried. And some families don't end. They wait. They leave signs, not words. They keep the firewood stacked, the paths swept, the silence clean. And even after you're gone, they tend the place like memory. Because home is not where you stay. It's where someone remembers how to find you. Some stories are not meant to be shouted. They don't crash through the world demanding to be believed. They move quieter, like wind through pine, or the hush of snow settling on an empty roof. These are the stories that live on the edge of what we know and what we feel, where truth isn't always something you can hold, but something you recognize in your bones. Because sometimes what matters most doesn't make headlines. It doesn't need proof or praise. Sometimes it's a silent act of mercy, a small gesture left behind in the dark, a door left unlocked, a fire kept burning for someone who may never come back. And maybe, just maybe, love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the decision to keep someone else safe, even when no one's watching. It's the patience to listen to the parts of the world that don't speak our language, the willingness to protect what can't be explained, and the courage to walk away without needing credit, only knowing in your heart that something sacred passed through your life and changed you. Because family isn't always blood, and home isn't always a house. Sometimes it's the space between two beings who choose not to fear each other, who meet in silence and leave something behind, a mark, a sign, a memory, so the other knows they were seen and safe. In the end, the quiet stories endure, not because they are shouted, but because they are carried, from hand to hand, from heart to heart, passed down in the way we care, the way we watch the woods a little longer than we used to, or how we leave room for the unknown to sit at our table without question. And if you're still listening, still feeling something lingering in your chest long after the last word, maybe that's the story asking to stay with you a little while longer. Let it. Thank you for being here, for holding space for gentleness, for mystery, and for the kind of hope that lives just beyond the tree line. If this story moved you, even just a little, we'd love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more quiet tales like this, and don't forget to follow the channel so you never miss the next whisper in the woods.